This is the Wheels for Wellbeing 5th edition Guide to Inclusive Cycling webinar, number 2 of 3, on infrastructure, barriers and enablers to inclusive cycling, presented by Kate Ball, Campaigns and Policy Lead for Wheels for Wellbeing. The photo on this slide shows a group of people using tricycles and a bicycle on a road, a busy road, being followed by a large double-decker red bus coming under a bridge. With thanks to the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund for supporting the development of the 5th edition Guide to Inclusive Cycling and this webinar series. Any errors or omissions in the Guide to Inclusive Cycling and this presentation are the author's sole responsibility. The contents reflects the views of the authors and not necessarily those of the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund. The Guide to Inclusive Cycling 5th edition webinar series starts with an Introduction to Inclusive Cycling webinar. Second is this webinar, Infrastructure, Barriers and Enablers to Inclusive Cycling. And third, Micromobilities and Disabled People. In this webinar, we will look at access for all. Who are we designing for? Most of the webinar is on inclusive design features, infrastructure for equity in active travel. And then we'll look at how to develop inclusive designs, combining evidence, guidance, standards and legal requirements with consultation and co-production. First, the barriers to cycling for disabled people. This shows why infrastructure is such a critical consideration. Wheels for Wellbeing's 2021 National Survey, analysed in 2022, showed that infrastructure was a serious consideration as a barrier for over half of all respondents, and parking and storage affected about a third of respondents. We know from Motability Foundation work in 2022 and the 2024 National Travel Survey that disabled people make at least a third fewer journeys across all transport types than non-disabled people. So transport inequality is a huge problem. So we need to think about who we're designing for when we create infrastructure for cycling, walking, wheeling and other active travel, including cycling speed, powered mobility aid use. When we design for cyclists, shown on the left as two people riding sporty bikes away from the camera, wearing lots of lycra and clippy shoes, we tend to end up designing for non-disabled adults who are travelling alone and are happy to move on roads, often mixing with high-speed vehicles, but that's not a majority of the population. Routes that are suitable for a sensible 12-year-old are a much better idea, but still a sensible 12-year-old is excluding an awful lot of people. A sensible 12-year-old is in probably their second year of secondary school. We wouldn't really want to be designing so people at upper primary age and people who are in the first bits of secondary school cannot walk, wheel or cycle to school alone. Surely our public spaces should be safe enough so that everyone from 8 to 80 and beyond, shown on the right-hand image in this slide, is able to get around as they need and want to in their own communities, walking, wheeling, cycling, using all kinds of cycling equivalent mobility aids. So on this image, we have somebody using a rollator who's accompanying two small children, somebody using a manual wheelchair with a hand cycle attachment, somebody pushing a double buggy while jogging, an adult who's accompanying a child on a kick scooter, an adult on a mobility scooter, an adult on an e-scooter, an adult using a power attachment on a wheelchair, two people using a side-by-side tandem, our sensible 12-year-old who's accompanied by a younger sibling this time, somebody with an assistance dog, a little person on a bike, and a power chair user who's using a wheelchair transporter trike propelled by an assistant. When we explicitly design for really diverse individuals and groups using our public spaces are as accessible for as many people as possible for as many people as possible. So when we think about disabled people using cycles and other aids, we really need to consider the full range of aids and make sure we're designing for them. That actually doesn't need to be a very complicated thing to do. Non-standard cycles and other aids, including larger devices, will have larger turning circles. They can be manoeuvred by mounted riders only. You cannot dismount and push, and you cannot ask for high levels of dexterity of people using spaces in the same way that you wouldn't ask a car driver to get out and push their vehicle either. And we need people to be able to move in groups with other cycle and other mobility aid users who are assisting each other within that group. And we'll talk more about that later. So we're designing spaces to be reliably and easily accessible. Just using the cycle design vehicle that exists in cycle design guidance makes that really simple. If you design for the cycle design vehicle, it's probably going to work for everybody reasonably well. And there are a few extra tweaks making sure that designs really are suitable for the cycle design vehicle. On the right, we've got disabled people using a range of wheeled and amplified mobility aids. So again, somebody using a power attachment, a mobility scooter, a power chair, people using a tandem cycle, a tandem mobility scooter, a bicycle, a hand cycle, and a sit-on e-scooter. There are many, many different types of mobility aids that different disabled people use, and many disabled people use a range of different mobility aids to meet different mobility needs. But what about accompanied groups? That's when we have 2 or more people making a trip together and the group cannot safely split up. Accompanied groups using active travel, especially, are disproportionately likely to include people with protected characteristics and people experiencing socio-economic disadvantage. So, for example, we know people who are making trips with small children are disproportionately likely to be female. Disabled people making trips have all the same reasons for making trips as non-disabled people. So on our diagram on the right, we've got the same accompanied group making trips 3 different ways. At the bottom, they're in a van. They're not going to be asked to split up. Everyone is contained and everybody remains safe. At the top, they're walking and wheeling. So you've got an adult using a mobility scooter, an adult pushing a double buggy, and a child on a kick scooter. They cannot split up because they are supporting each other as they make their journey. In the next drawing down in the middle between the van and the pedestrians, they are cycling and using cycling speed mobility aids. So again, there's an adult using a mobility scooter. The child who was on the kick scooter is now using a bicycle, and the adult who was pushing the double buggy now has a rear child seat and a child trailer. Accompanied groups need to move as a single unit. They cannot split up. That means over crossing points and through complex and busy spaces, as well as on general areas of routes. And they need to stay together on public transport vehicles for the travel to be accessible. And when people are making journeys, you need to go from anywhere to anywhere. We need all journey start and end points to be accessibly joined together. That's because utility trips for active travel typically have fixed start and end points. So if you're going to school or to work, if you're going to a hospital appointment, if you're even going for many leisure different types of trips like going to a swimming lesson or going to a gym class, meeting up with friends, visiting relatives, if you're carrying out caring responsibilities, you will need to make them to a fixed destination and often at a fixed time as well. So we need accessible routes for trips between every home and every potential destination. We need safe routes for all users of all ages and all capacities. And we need public transport access for longer multimodal trips. If you have to drive or be driven to the start of an accessible route, that is not compatible with making utility journeys with active travel. By definition, it's fine if you have to drive or if you want to drive to the start of a route and you're able to do that, but for many people that is simply not an option and it is not a practical way to make local trips. So on the right, this image, we've got an example of a typical local trip. It's drawn out and people might want to pause the slides to have a look at this a bit more closely if they're interested, because it's not that clear with the size it is at the moment. And it's showing a school run, just a map route drawn out and 3 options for making the trip. One route is largely off-road and protected from motor vehicle traffic, but it's 3 times as long as the 2 routes that go along busy roads. The routes along busy roads have many controlled and uncontrolled crossings that need to be made. And if you look closely, the little red crosses that say there's a non-cycle permitted footway are there present for every single one of those routes. There is no legal route that is safe enough to use for inclusive active travel, because all of the roads that are shown along those routes have critical fails according to cycle design guidance for safety. So they are too unsafe to use, but there is no alternative protected route. And this is really typical. So poor accessibility on active travel route options closes off utility active travel for many, many disabled people. We need to be able to make journeys at peak times as well. So there's quite a common thing that happens of, well, we can just wait till it's quieter, wait till it's safer for making journeys. That doesn't work. If you're making utility journeys, you need to make them at peak times as well as at quiet times. If you're travelling to education, employment, appointments, care commitments, or again, for many different leisure types of trip, you will need to be travelling when many other people are travelling too. Disabled people make trips for exactly the same reasons as non-disabled people, so we need disabled people's movement to be accounted for on carriageways, footways, cycle tracks, and when public transport is busy too. So that means capacities, infrastructure capacities, need to account for disabled people's movement at peak times. On the right, we've got a journey being made by a number of different people using active travel at peak times, where there are drivers parked on pavements and trying to make it up a narrow, typical terraced road. At the top it says, our confidence training sessions mean everyone can choose active travel. There's a driver shouting at somebody using a long cane, I need to park here, you can squeeze through or go on the road. Another driver on the road is shouting at people who are cycling, get off the road, you'll get your kid killed. And a child cycling down the pavement on the other side is being shouted at by another driver saying, get off the pavement, you're a danger to pedestrians. So we need that point to be made that people using active travel need to be able to move around at all times, including peak times. We need to be able to move at all other times as well, not just peak times, all year, all day and all night. So that means routes need to ensure that a majority of people are able to risk assess active travel modes as safe enough for themselves and their family or friends. That means we need physical safety from drivers, en route and route adjacent hazards, temporary and permanent hazards, and from breakdown, injury or illness. We need social safety, so risk from other public space users not in motor vehicles, so harassment and assault risks need to be reduced. And risks are higher for people with protected characteristics, and especially intersectional protected characteristics, so where you have more than one protected characteristic, disabled and female and from a minoritised ethnic group. It's not about confidence or feelings. The genuine risks of injuries and harassment and assaults are higher if you have protected characteristics, so if you are a disabled person. So routes need to be consistently safe to use at all times all year for accessible active travel. And the drawing on the right here shows a person using a manual wheelchair with a power attachment coming under a street light, looking fairly scared in the dark, and there's a group of silhouettes nearby that look quite threatening. It says traffic free does not mean safe. So how do we achieve this inclusive design? We said what the basics need to be. And what we need to do is just underpin everything with the Equality Act and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, together with the social model of disability. And if we use all of those really important concepts and laws to create all of the designs for our infrastructure, all of the principles that we work on, then it's probably all going to work out pretty well. So start out by using the Guide to Inclusive Cycling, which obviously Wheels for Wellbeing, we think that's a pretty good place to go, and the associated guide sheets that are all available free on our website. And there are plenty of wider resources which are referenced in all of our resources as well. So that's LTM 120, England and Northern Ireland Cycle Design Guidance, the Wales Active Travel Act Guidance, Scotland's Cycling by Design, Inclusive Mobility, Transport for London's Pedestrian Comfort Guidance. That's the best one that we've found so far for considering how pedestrians need to move around spaces, including when it's busy. Safety at Streetworks and Roadworks 2013, which is statutory guidance. It has to be followed for temporary works. BS 8300, Design of an Accessible and Inclusive Built Environment. So that's the British standard for making accessible spaces, pretty much. Building Regulations Approved Document M, and there are lots more. So you can't just look at one set of guidance to work out how to make inclusive infrastructure, which is a little bit problematic, but that's how it is. It's a big area and there are lots of different things. So in our guides, we're often pulling together elements from lots of different sets of guidance. And on the right, there's a picture example of that from one of our guides, looking at minimum widths for passing on low use active travel routes. So what width should a route be? That sounds pretty simple. LTM 120 says the minimum width for a shared use path, that's fairly low volume use, should be 3 meters. So we've then added up, okay, where do we get those widths from different places? Well, a cyclist width from LTM 120 is about 1.2 metres. You need half a metre to pass people. That's again from LTM 120, but that's might be quite tight if people are a little bit less stable, or if people are moving particularly fast, if cyclists are moving particularly fast especially. Then the pedestrian comfort guidance says you need half a metre's minimum edge buffer on each side, 0.2 metres minimum edge buffer on each side for pedestrians. You don't want to wobble and fall off a curb. You need a much bigger buffer on each side if you're putting cycles next to a raised feature like a wall or a hedge. And we'd argue that pedestrians also need quite a bit of edge space more if there are raised edges that might grow, such as a hedge. And then you need 1.2 metre width for a pedestrian with an assistant from Inclusive Mobility. So if you add all those things up, do you get a 3 metre minimum shared path width? Well, no, you get 3.3 metres. And that's even if there aren't those higher edge constraints that might need more space. And it's even if you don't think about more problematic hazards. So if it's just the edge of a curb, maybe 0.2 metres is not too close to be, but maybe if it's a fall into a river, you might want a bit more space. So looking at the different ideas, you have to pull together lots of different areas of guidance. We think that's really, really important to make sure spaces are accessible. And it means thinking about a lot of different factors, even for things that look fairly simple. So if we look in a bit more detail at some of the points that have been made earlier, so talking about how you get accessibility of space, the first thing that often springs to mind is physical access barriers. So physical access barriers can be designed or unintentional. They can be permanent or temporary. So you might have put in that barrier on purpose, or something might have blown there, fallen off a tree. An obstruction might have been created even though it was never supposed to be there. We need barriers to be removed, whether or not they are meant to be there and whether or not they're permanent or temporary. A barrier is anything that reduces the width of a route below a 1.5 metre straight line access. Anything that you have to physically interact with to pass is inaccessible, even if when it's open there is more than a 1.5 metre access. So any gate is inaccessible. If you need to use your hands to open it, it is a problem. Damaged, loose and steep surfaces are also barriers. Tight turns, steep slopes, steps and missing dropped curbs are all barriers. We need routes to be as accessible for walking, wheeling and cycling as carriageways are for drivers. That's the basic principle. You don't see steps or massively tight chicanes that any vehicle cannot pass through on carriageways. We shouldn't be seeing the equivalents on cycle routes or pavements. And on the right hand side, we've got a graphic which has, just because some people can use, disabled people can use a route doesn't mean it's accessible. And that's one key point that we often get made as well. This person can get through, so it must be fine because they are disabled. And on the cartoon, it's got people saying, we can't use this route, please can you remove the barriers? And they're riding a tandem trike. A designer is saying, no, there's no need to change anything. Fred here says this chicane is accessible for him and he's disabled. There are 2 chicane barriers going onto an off-road route, and we're going to be looking a bit more at that later. So here we are, surface and space. Accessible spaces need to have smooth, step-free, high-friction, durable surfaces. They need to have enough space for users to move safely at peak times, and they need to have widths clear all the way from ground level to the full design height, and the design height will vary depending on which users are expected to be on the route. To improve accessibility and inclusion in designs, disabled and non-disabled people should be using the same routes if it's at all possible. So preferably do not send disabled people at 90 degrees to the route that non-disabled people are going to be going on. So don't make your ramp routes repeatedly pass over your stepped routes, because that's going to introduce huge amounts of conflict and make it very difficult for disabled people to use the route. Where there are complicated spaces, and that does happen, use swept path analyses to make sure that the spaces are going to be accessible. And again, we've got guides on our resource page on using swept path analysis for active travel to make sure that spaces are accessible. On the right, we've got a picture from one of our videos, which is about hazard creation with safety barriers. So it's showing a chicane very like the one on the last graphic, where narrow drop curb and the barriers of the chicane itself are forcing people to wait on the road at busy times. So you've got a family at the bottom left with a trike, a trailer and bikes, somebody using a mobility scooter, and they're stuck on the road because a recumbent cyclist and a cargo or child carrier cycle user are coming out through the chicane. Somebody using an assistant propelled wheelchair is not able to get onto the route at all. So routes need to be made usable even at peak times, and so that's a sort of an application of one of the points that was being made earlier. You need the planning to account for the peak numbers of people that need to pass through the space and for accessibility at quiet times as well. A key part of calculating whether a space is accessible is the gradients and crossfalls. So gradients are just slopes, any kind of slope. A crossfall is a slope at right angles to the direction that you should be travelling down a route, or that you're expected to travel down the route. Crossfalls can make people tip over very easily, so they're particularly important, and they make spaces very, very difficult to roll across, and that's shown in the top half of the graphic to the right. Ramps are gradients in the direction that you're expecting to go along a route, and they're between 1 in 20 and 1 in 12. Anything steeper than that is too steep for most public spaces, and too steep for most mobility aid users to get up and down safely. Some slope is needed for drainage, so you can't have completely flat spaces, otherwise you tend to get puddles forming and ice forming, and you get mosses growing, and spaces end up very slippery a lot of the time if they are too flat and don't have good enough drainage. You get a lot of debris build-up as well. And many slopes are unavoidable. If you're in a hilly space, you're going to have to get up and down the hills, but you can do it in ways that make spaces as easy as possible to use, because all slopes make spaces harder to use for many disabled people. Steep slopes are inaccessible and dangerous. They can, as we said, cause people to tip over. So in designs, you need to minimise gradients and crossfall by following good design guidance. On the right here, we've mentioned the top has some of the reasons that crossfall matters and the risks that it causes. And at the bottom, we've got some common locations for issues and ways to solve them. So for driveways and vehicle crossovers where you get dropped curbs, you can ensure designs keep a 1.5 metre width safe level footway at all times. The picture for that has some wheelie bins down the pavement, at the back of the pavement, as people are trying to walk down it and use a mobility scooter down it. That's a really key issue that we come across a lot, where wheelie bins take up the flat bit of the pavement and everyone using mobility aids has to go on the really slopey bit right where the vehicle crossovers are put in. On carriageway cycle lanes tend to have a similar problem, where they're right at the edge of a carriageway where the slope tends to be really quite steep down into drainage. So it's a case of designers checking the crossfalls during surveys, altering the gradients and making sure that the drainage is still working as required. And then at chicanes and access restrictions, they keep on coming up. They're often put onto slopey areas where traffic-free routes meet other routes, so roads, or where two traffic-free routes join, because there's often a level change. But if you put barriers on those, you force people to go across the slopes. That makes a very steep crossfall, and that makes spaces inaccessible and dangerous. So removing barriers is a really great way of reducing inaccessible and dangerous gradients on routes. Then we need to think about continuity and wayfinding. How do you make a route easy to use, and why does that matter for accessibility? Well, decision making and complexity and stress are really key elements of accessibility. The harder a route is to use, the more stressful, the more complex, the harder it is to go the right way, the more inaccessible a route is. So we need clear, simple, visible and tactile layouts. Tactile routes need to be absolutely clearly demarcated at all times. Pedestrian and cycle movements need to be prioritised over junctions and crossings. Where pedestrian and cycle routes cross, the pedestrian movement needs to be prioritised. We need open sight lines. That's not just so that you can see vehicle movements and other route users, it's so that you can check where the route is going up ahead. It's so that it makes the decision making as easy as possible for working out where you're going. And we need appropriate accessible signage as well. And what is appropriate will vary a lot depending on the type of route that it is. But it's that point about reducing the mental load that's required to use routes, whether you're a new user of the route or an experienced user of that route. So the drawing on the right here shows a simple layout. It doesn't have to be complex. In fact, for continuity and wayfinding, the simpler the better. It's got speed limit signs, It's got a raised table over a T-junction with give-way markings, so the drivers are being given a really clear message with tight radii and all the markings that they need to give way to everybody crossing over on the protected cycle track and the protected pavement. There's tactile separation between the cycle track and the pavement. There's tactile paving to tell visually impaired and blind people that there is a road crossing where they may be interacting with vehicles, so that people know what might be where. And this very, very explicit priority, and the colour of the route as well makes it really clear to people cycling or using the cycle route using the different mobility aids that is where the route is going next. So it makes it a really easy space to use. And we've already mentioned physical and social safety for routes briefly, so you can use it, that all day, all night, all year concept. So how do you actually achieve physical and social safety? Well, a lot of it's things we've already talked about. Accessible all-weather surfaces, no constrained spaces or barriers, clear sight lines, maximising natural surveillance. That might include lighting and glare reduction, so you've got clear light, you can see all spaces, nowhere is excessively shadowy or hidden. You need removal of hazards or edge protection from hazards. So that might be protection from drivers, protection from falls, protection from water. And really reliable maintenance. We'll be looking into that a bit more later. And the ability to get help. That means that you need to be close enough to spaces where you can escape from the route or where people can get to you. It needs to not be huge, long, isolated stretches. So routes can be both attractive and hazardous. Anywhere that a road would have safety barriers, a cycle route should have safety barriers too, as a basic principle. And we've got a photo here of a really pretty route through a city centre under a historic bridge. It goes onto a boardwalk that's just over 2 metres wide with no edge protection and a fall into a river. That is not something you would do for a motor vehicle route. You would not have a key route with a drop into a river with absolutely no barriers at all. We shouldn't be having that for walking, wheeling and cycling routes if we wouldn't have it for drivers too. And then when we've got to our destinations on our lovely accessible active travel routes, what do we do with our cycles and other mobility aids? Well, we need parking, storage and venue access. Basic principles are consistent across all the different cycle parking types, but you end up with different provision depending on what parking type is needed. So is it private or public parking? Is it short or long stay? Is it high use or low use? What sorts of cycles are going to be there if it's private? And so on. Basic principles are that as far as possible, and again, small private provision is a little bit different from public provision. Provision needs to be step-free and hands-free, with no dismount required before you get to the stands. Stands need to have multiple locking options. That's lots of different positions that you can put a lock onto them, because different shapes of cycles need locking up in different places. That's fairly obvious. Stands need to be spaced for larger cycle access, so that's turning circles into them, but it's also the actual space around the stands themselves. If you have stands that are too close together, it's not going to work. Disabled bays need to be clearly marked and have dismount and access width. You need good social and physical safety. That keeps coming up. The cycle stands cannot be around the back of a building by the bins in a dark alleyway. That is not going to be safe for the cycles or safe for anybody going to put a cycle in or take a cycle out either. Disabled cycle parking needs to be as close to venue accesses as disabled car parking. And where at all possible to expand provision, there should be protocols that allow for that. So some monitoring to make sure that if spaces are getting filled up, whether that's the standard spaces or the disabled spaces or both, provision can be expanded. That means that you've got the best possible chance that when somebody disabled comes along, there is going to be a space free for them to use. So accessibility requirements for different types of inclusive cycle parking. A couple of the diagrams from our cycle parking guide sheet are shown here. One is accessible cycle parking bay features for on-street or in large public space stands. So you've got some bollards protecting from vehicles, and you've got marked coloured bays with paired stands. So that means that people have got loads of different locking options so that they can position a cycle that's quite big in a way that's still going to fit within the bay. level footway access, roll in, roll out positioning. And then on the bottom, there's an accessible cycle store entry, which is showing the sorts of distances and spacing that you need between door controls and the accessible automatic doors themselves with the swing at the door. If you put buttons for access onto a door, you can't use it if you need to stay mounted on your cycle until you get to the stands. You can't push a button that's on a door and then somehow magically back out of the way if you're using a cycle that doesn't have a reverse option. So thinking about all of the different factors is something that's provided in our cycle design guide sheets. And then there's the supporting infrastructure as well. So when you're on your route or when you've got to a destination, what sorts of things do we need to make a whole space and a whole society more accessible for inclusive active travel? Well, we need cycle provision, and we can extend that to needing mobility aid provision more widely. Can you get hold of a cycle? Can you buy one? Can you hire one? How can you get it maintained? What about breakdown and rescue if something goes a bit pear-shaped when you're out on a ride, getting from A to B? It's exactly the same sorts of things that you'd expect to be provided as a matter of course if you had a car. And we need the same thing for all cycles and mobility aids to be available. And then we need the public realm more widely than just the accessible routes to be as accessible as possible, appropriate to the location. So most locations it's completely appropriate to provide accessible seating. Our streetscapes really need more accessible seating and green spaces. Wherever we are, accessible seating is generally a reasonable thing to provide. It may or may not be reasonable to provide toilets, disabled toilets and changing places toilets especially, shelter, warm spaces, food and drink on sale, and then public transport integration as well. So different spaces will need different levels of all of those, but they are all really important for accessibility. More people will be able to use spaces, the more of those that are available. And we've mentioned seating a few times there, and on the right is one of our diagrams from our guide to accessible seating. And that's such an important element. And again, it's a situation where in Wheels for Wellbeing, we've pulled together guidance from loads of different spaces, referenced it all, added it all together, and looked at what the sorts of things are that designers and decision makers should be thinking about when they're putting in accessible seating infrastructure. And what about temporary work? So again, we've mentioned those briefly before. And the key point here is that reliable route accessibility is absolutely critical. Often disabled people are using the only route in an area that they are able to use. If that gets closed by works, there aren't going to be other options unless really careful signed diversions with information and often actual support for making the route work out is provided. So keep routes open for walking, wheeling and cycling, even if motor vehicles are diverted. The energy and effort that people are having to use to walk, wheel or cycle a journey is really big. So making sure that people are able to keep on their familiar, short, practical routes is really, really important. If routes absolutely have to be closed, then those diversions, information and support are absolutely critical. And disabled cyclists must always be supported to remain cycling slowly through work. So no cyclist dismount signs, which just encourage abuse. And on the right, there's a photo of a good alternative example, which is cyclist dismount unless a mobility aid, which was put up at Wandsworth Bridge in very constrained works a couple of years ago. The photo on the left of that is emergency works, where a really quite nice asphalt layer has been laid on a membrane over the top of a verge, where emergency works are having to take place all of a sudden. And that's because this site is really quite steeply sloped and on a dual carriageway, and it's just made sure that people who need to use what's a very busy pavement and an important route are able to keep doing so as easily as possible during completely unavoidable emergency works. So that's a couple of examples of really good practice. Making sure that Safety at Streetworks and Roadworks 2013 statutory guidance is followed and exceeded, because it doesn't actually give enough access widths, even really for disabled pedestrians, and certainly not for disabled people using slightly larger mobility aids, including cycles. We need, again, just reiterating that access needs to be resilient, whether that's works or anything else. So designing for low maintenance requirements. If you make the design work for low maintenance, the space is likely to stay usable. So that's durable materials and surfaces. Vegetation planting planned carefully so that it's not going to keep overgrowing a route. Seasonal planning, including drainage, making sure that spaces stay as clear as possible of water, ice and debris. Low risk of unexpected or predictable obstruction. So is it in a location which is likely to experience vandalism and fly tipping? How open can you keep those sightlines? What's the natural surveillance like? Is it in a location that's likely to flood most years, some years, ever? What about fallen trees? So getting that vegetation planning right. What about ice and other debris? Scheduling and funding maintenance is absolutely critical. So seasonal maintenance, is it going to need gritting? Regular maintenance, it's going to need sweeping pretty often to make sure that things like broken glass and dog mess don't stay on a path, both of which can be journey ending for disabled people. And you need emergency funding, so when that tree falls over or when the huge amount of fly tipping suddenly appears, the path can be cleared. Because again, reliable accessibility is absolutely critical for inclusive active travel. On the photo on the right, we've got a path that's been blocked by fly tipping. It's a path with very poor natural surveillance, and so it's again particularly vulnerable to this kind of issue. On the right of the photo, you can see there's a path where people walking and wheeling have been able to get around the edge, but if you are a disabled person, that's a really soft verge. It's going to be very, very challenging, if it's possible at all, to get around that edge using a wheelchair or even many mobility scooters. You probably manage it on many cycles, but not all, because it's quite slopey. So again, tricycles would be more at risk. So these kinds of obstructions massively affect disabled people more than non-disabled people. So it's really important to minimise the risk of obstructions and closures of routes. So how do we develop inclusive designs? We've talked a lot about ensuring that we're hitting existing good practice or exceeding existing good practice found in legislation and guidance. But co-production and high quality inclusive consultation from the very beginning of scheme planning is essential. You can't go to people 90% of the way through a scheme and go, well, do you reckon this is all right? And expect to get to an inclusive and truly accessible endpoint. You need diverse representation, promoting typically minoritized perspectives in decision-making roles of projects. If everybody who's designing the project isn't really focusing on the accessibility is unlikely to happen. And you need to promote collaboration by respecting expertise of those involved. That includes by paying all participants, but it also includes making sure that people are asked to stay within their expertise area. So respecting that the engineers know about engineering and respecting that the people who use the area know about how they use that area. People who have expertise in how mobility aids move should be using that expertise. Because too often what we see is people being asked to comment on schemes and asked to give solutions for how to solve engineering problems as disabled members of the public, and that's just not fair. You need the engineers to be collaborating with the disabled participants who are not engineers to come to solutions that are going to work for everybody. So it's working together and respecting everybody's expertise. And provide information in a range of accessible formats without being asked. So some people are going to have less common access needs, but where there are common access needs for having things in word processor formats, large print, for needing audio versions, there are many different things that can be done to make sure that accessible versions of information are provided ahead of being asked, and that gives the message that when somebody asks for something that's slightly different outside that realm, they're going to be able to get hold of it. That's really important. Otherwise, people cannot contribute in the way that they would otherwise be able to. Accessible information is critical. So disabled people who use cycle, pedestrian and public transport infrastructure will provide critical insights for schemes. And the photo here is of people using a whole range of different cycles on a cycle piece of cycle infrastructure, and you can see actually that the infrastructure is not really wide enough for everybody who's using it. It's next to a busy road, so you wouldn't want to be on the carriageway, but really the cycle infrastructure also needs a little bit more space. Thank you for listening. You can read a lot more about infrastructure in our guide to inclusive cycling and our resources, and there's a link here and a QR code, or contact us for more information on our training and consultancy services at info@wheelsforwellbeing.org.uk.